Well, welcome back to part two of the Worship Lounge interview with Marilyn McIntyre, a visiting professor at CDSP and a friend of St. John's. We were talking about medicine and art and theology and how those dimensions interact with one another especially during plagues and times of distress. And today we're going to jump into an actual biblical story, which I will let Marilyn begin with. Welcome back.
Thank you, Scott. And just jump in anytime. I'm sure you're as familiar with this story as I am, at least. But this is the story of Naaman in 2 Kings chapter 5, if anybody wants to look that up. And it occurred to me last week when we were talking about the stories, the long literature of plagues and epidemics and public health crises, and how all of those stories travel similar arcs. That there are these biblical stories about healing that are also teaching tales that are still very pertinent points of reference for us as we go through a public health crisis. And this is one that I have taken particular interest in because it has so many layers of complexity. And each one of them, I think, is something that we are looking at right now. So I thought what I would do, and I'm hoping that you'll interrupt anytime you want to say anything, is just kind of walk through the story. It's only 19 verses, and I'm not going to read all of them. But the story starts with Naaman, who's the commander of an army of King Aram. And it says in the text, he was a great man and in high favor with his master. So the first piece of information we get is that this is a person who has political power. He's not at the top of the pecking order, but he has a lot of power and he's in favor with the people in power. So we've been witnessing a lot of that. All people standing around on public podiums, silently supporting Trump and others as they make their announcements. And if you're in favor with the people who have power, that's a precarious place to be. But then he gets leprosy. He was a mighty warrior. That was another thing. He was a military commander. So he has a kind of power that's associated with a sort of invulnerability. People are counting on him. And then he gets leprosy. And leprosy is absolutely the worst. It's not only a terrifying disease and essentially a death or exile sentence, it's shameful and has all kinds of stigma attached to it. So one of the first messages in the story is sickness comes to everybody, which would seem to be obvious, except that most of us are aware of how much sickness and poverty go together, because sanitation is a privilege and because healthcare is a privilege. Shouldn't be, but it is. So the fact that when people in power get sick, everybody's taken aback in a new way. And I think about when we all first heard that Tom Hanks had COVID-19, or we just heard today, I think, that Chris Cuomo has it. You know, so we hear about these people with the big names, the wife of the Canadian Prime Minister. And that, even though some of us may resent the fact that celebrities get tested and a lot of other people don't, there's some way in which the people with celebrity represent a kind of vulnerability that we don't want to have to face. So again, very early in this story, the information comes that the notion that wealth insulates us from illness is delusional. There are things that money and power can't solve. So
can I ask just to raise a point there to get you to reflect on it, is that I think we have only begun to realize the shock of all of this to us as a country. And when I say that, I'm not assuming that we're all wealthy or powerful, but certainly as a privileged people, maybe I'm speaking more as a white man here, that there's a sense in which there's this invulnerability,
Right.
economic invulnerability, physical invulnerability, the sense that, well, at least the upper tiers of our world have access to these things,
Right.
but those barriers have broken down, and it's made us all vulnerable, and uh, you know, the impact of that, I think, has yet to be fully comprehended or understood. Uh, I, in its best terms, you could almost say it's a forced empathy. That
Right.
we've tended to say, well, that's really sad that people have to experience that. Now we're saying we know more of what that's like when you're feeling frightened, threatened, out of control. We've lost control. That we're, and how do you, how, what are your reflections about that? I mean, that seems to be a big curve that we're on right now.
Well, interestingly, one of the things that seems to happen at the beginning of these stories of epidemics and pandemics is there's always some kind of scapegoating. And if not scapegoating, at least an effort to identify a population so that the rest of us can say, well, it pretty much mostly happens to those people. Like clearly in the AIDS epidemic, it was a long time before people were willing to really look at the fact that this wasn't just happening to gay men.
Mm-hmm.
And there were a lot of people who were willing to say, okay, that's those people. And we don't have to somehow identify with them. We might be sympathetic, we might contribute to the cause, but we don't have to think of ourselves as vulnerable as long as they are the ones getting it. And in this situation, I've also heard similar, milder kinds of conversation about, well, it mostly happens to people over 65 with pre-existing conditions. That little phrase comes up over and over, except that the statistics are showing that a lot of the cases are much younger people. So, but I think there's always an effort to make it those people so that we can postpone feeling vulnerable as long as possible.
Right.
Once we do recognize that we are in an affected population, we really have to come into a place of solidarity that's new for people who have felt insulated or protected.
So,
Yeah, so,
back to Naaman here.
so back to Naaman. He's got this powerful guy. He's got this terrible disease with a social stigma and a lot of shame. And then he goes to his wife has a servant girl who has come from the Israelites. She's young, she's female, she's a captive from Israel, and she serves his wife. So she's got all these strikes against her. She has zero power or influence. She comes out of the back corner and she says to Naaman's wife, if only my Lord were with the prophet who is in Samaria, he would cure him of his leprosy. So the word of healing comes from this completely out in left field place. And one of the lessons here, of course, is that healing discoveries and so on sometimes come from oddball places. And it's usually somebody who's willing to step outside the box somehow, who will make the scientific discovery or who will consign funding to some unlikely experiment or something. But so part of the teaching tale is that you're not going to get solutions from the same sources that created the problem. This is like Einstein saying that we can't solve a problem on the level on which it was created. So Naaman has to go outside the box. So his wife tells him that, and he goes to his commander, the king, and tells him what's going on. And so the king says, okay, I will send a letter to the king of Israel. And it's interesting that he doesn't say, okay, go see the prophet. He says, well, I'm a king. I'll talk to their king. So this is still a king to king transaction. We're still going to keep it in the halls of power, but I'm not going to go talk to some outback prophet. from Israel. So Naaman goes and he sees the king of Israel with this letter. And the king, I love this part of the story. It's kind of comic, but the king of Israel responds, "What, you think I'm God, that I'm going to heal you?" He hates this because now he's been put in a diplomatic quandary. And think about all of the diplomacy issues that are coming around this pandemic right now.
Mm-hmm.
It's always political, and there are always matters of diplomacy. And the whole thing about calling it a Chinese virus, right, is just so odious. But yeah, so this puts the king of Israel in a very awkward position because he can't heal Naaman, and he knows that. And he also may have his own rivalry with the prophet. You know, the kings want to contain the power of the prophet. But he says, well, so the point here is that Naaman is seeking healing in the wrong place. He's looking to political authority. He's looking to the establishment. Both kings are afraid now. But so he ends up actually going to the king. Let's see. He sent a message to the king. "Why have you torn your clothes? Let him come to..." Oh, Elisha hears about this. That's where the story goes. Elisha's the prophet. He hears about this and he sends a message to the king of Israel and says, "Tell him to come to me, that he might learn that there is a prophet in Israel." But here's an interesting thing. He doesn't go to the king and offer his services. So it's like, if you want this, you have to come. And I think about these other healings, like the woman in the New Testament story where she touches the hem of Jesus's garment. She has to really go out on a limb. She's not supposed to be there in the first place. She's breaking 3 or 4 different social rules to do this, right? So, so he goes to see the prophet, and Elisha gives him really unwelcome advice, which is, you want to be healed? Go wash yourself 7 times in the Jordan. So the problem with this is that Naaman wants the best treatment. He wants to go to the best guy. And he's telling him to go wash himself in what was apparently a muddy river, really unappealing. And he says, "We have rivers in our own country. What do I need to do this for?" And he's outraged.
Well, isn't it also, it's also true that actually Elisha doesn't tell him that face to face.
Oh, that's right.
Then someone says, "Go tell him just to go get in the river 7 times." So
That's
he
right.
doesn't even show him the dignity of saying, "Oh, let me come out and greet you officially." He pays, pays there's no respect there. It's like, if he wants this is what he needs to do. Just go tell him to do it. So it's like a double slap in the face that
Right.
he doesn't go out to greet the man.
Thank you. Yeah, I'd forgotten that piece of it, which is really important. Again, it's a sort of double whammy. You come to me, I'm going to send my servant out to you. So there's a lot of breaking down of the class barriers, that you don't get to trade on class to get healed. Well, so he's outraged. He goes home. His servants, Naaman's servants at home, hear this story. And once again, it's the servants who come and say, "Wait, what? There's a way to be healed. Why wouldn't you take this? Just do it." So the servants come in with this wisdom that's grounded and earthy and logical, and they're the ones to deliver the healing word. So he finally goes, and when he goes back, he takes all this stuff with him. I think there are a lot of comic elements to this story, right? But I'm going to try to find this list of stuff that he takes. It was
I think if Martin Scorsese would have a fun making a movie of this. I mean, it's got all the right stuff in it.
right. It's like this big, he takes animals and he takes this big pile of shekels and he takes jewelry and clothing and so on to pay the prophet. He goes and he bathes in the river and his flesh was restored. And this is a really interesting little piece that I learned at some point, like the flesh of a young child. And that word for young child is the word that's associated with the young servant girl at the beginning. So he becomes like her. Don't you love that?
And I do. And I think that there's something about, when they say something is skin deep, right? Or this is kind of a disease of the outside. In other words, people are often more concerned about how they appear or how they're seen as opposed to who they are. And here's a situation where he's got to change and let go of all of that to align his outer being with something. The inner being, I guess, has to sort of change first. To say, okay, I don't have to follow the way of my thinking in order to receive healing. It's sort of counterintuitive.
Yeah. I have to let go of my prestige. I have to let go of my role. I have to leave my country. I have to accept the fact that I'm being treated like a foreigner. I'm giving up my claim to special treatment. Does that mean we're out of time?
I don't know where that came from.
Okay. But so then he goes with all this stuff and he tries to pay Elisha after he's healed. And Elisha says, I will accept nothing. So then he urges him to accept, because if he can pay him all this stuff, then he gets to get back a certain kind of power. It can make it into an economic transaction. And so think about the healthcare arguments that we're in now. The notion that healthcare is a human right is saying we don't get to put this on an economic basis. This is something everybody needs and everybody deserves, like water, which is also, we're arguing over the same issues with water. But there are certain things that if you're human and you live on the planet, you have a right to them. And so I will accept nothing is insisting that healing isn't simply reducible to an economic transaction. It's God's gift. It can't be bought. So the end of the story is, of course, that Naaman is persuaded and converted. His heart is changed. So that also it's yet again a story about the fact that when healing takes place, physical healing is a manifestation of spiritual healing, and that those two things intersect. They don't always go together. But I love that story for all that, we went through it very quickly here, but for all the many little details of decision points where Naaman has to come to terms with what's happening to him in a very inner way.
So, we're clearly in a place where we have a kind of way of seeing the world. That world has sort of crumbled. We're aware of an opportunity here to have some spiritual transformation.
Yeah.
How would you, as sort of as we bring this conversation to a close, how would you advise people to approach this time, to look at it with new eyes and maybe new, from a vulnerable place? I mean, as much as we want to run from being vulnerable or feeling like we're not in control, that is also a spiritual opportunity for us. How would you close the sermon if you were preaching on this?
I think that there's something about so many of the biblical stories and the stories that we get about human crises that is out of the depths. That one of the story forms that we've inherited from the Judeo-Christian culture is, I'm going to do this with my hand, but it goes down and then up. It's a story of death and transformation, or despair and hope. But it seems to me that to look for signs of hope isn't to go into denial and decide it's not that bad, but to say, wait a minute, what's kind of opening up here as we watch all of this difficult stuff unfold, and as so many of us feel endangered by the political situations we're in, that apparently we're still threatening Iran, and there are all kinds of dangers, not to mention climate change. You know, that stuff doesn't go away just because we're in a health crisis.
Right.
So there's a lot that's really scary, but in the midst of that, to think about that still point in the storm and to see how neighbors are noticing each other and how new kinds of solidarity are emerging and how people are supporting healthcare workers, is to notice how these little shoots of growth are coming in our awareness of each other and our connectedness. So we are connected as one poem. There's this lovely poem circulating called Pandemic by Lynn Ungar. And she says something like, we are connected in terrifying and beautiful ways. So just that we're connected by our vulnerability in terrifying ways, but the connectedness, I think, is one of the big themes to hang on to. Yeah. I notice when I go walking that people just we're all 6 feet apart, but we look at each other with this sort of we're in it together way of noticing each other. And I love that.
That's wonderful. Good point to end with there. And I want to thank you again, Marilyn, for taking the time to be on our worship lounge, and and we look forward to more opportunities to do this.
Thank you. Well, my greetings to people at St. John's. That's really, a lot of you are very much in my mind and my heart. See you next time.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.